Our Heavenly Family, we thank you so much for this time of the Sabbath that you've given to us. And I know that some are probably exiting it, but I'm sure they were blessed, and we thank you for whatever other blessings that any of us have received today and the blessings that we're about to receive as we consider your word more and consider your truth. And we ask that you be with us as we look through these things, and you send more angels into the homes of each one of us. So we just want to thank you for all the wonderful things that you've done for us, and we ask that each one here can fully receive the resurrection that we know that it's time to receive. So we thank you so much for this. And tonight we may be discussing some things that are in some ways perhaps hard to grasp, or not even if it's hard to grasp, but just thinking in different ways than perhaps we've thought before. So I ask that you expand all of our minds and prepare us to be able to see your truth in simplicity, how it really is. And we thank you so much for answering this according to your will. Anyways, I also just want to ask quickly that you be with the families of everyone that's here, and that you make us more and more able to show your love and to actually love them with the love that you have. We pray these things in the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
So the thing that we were going to be discussing here is what is God's relation to time, and that could be viewed in terms of just the Father or the whole Heavenly Family and their relation to time. But maybe we could just start off by those of you in Missouri, since you were discussing it today, would you mind just kind of letting us know, you said Teresa gave you a couple hints or something here and there, or kind of dropped a few things to pique your curiosity. Would you guys mind sharing what that was and kind of what you guys discussed so far on that?
Well, okay. I'll just start by saying a couple of things. I was thinking about something that Timothy brought up the other night when he was talking about the cycles of the the weekly cycle, the monthly cycle, the yearly cycle, daily cycle, and I was just we were kind of free associating a little bit, not trying to be too intellectual about it, but I remembered a dream that Norman had had several years ago, in which he saw, and I brought up, is anybody familiar with Lionsgate movies and the big machinery that they show at the beginning when a movie starts by Lionsgate? Anyway, it's all these big machines, the cogs and everything, and everything is all kind of working together. And so what our impression of that was that the different feast days, the different times of refreshing, work on us. These machines kind of work on us to change us, and we're thinking about that aspect, and I was thinking about, this is so abstract, it's probably ridiculous, but that will there ever come a time in which all of these different cycles line up, so that it's kind of all one thing in a sense, and and then just that related to the thought that what Trent was saying about, that the Heavenly Family live, they've always been in the past and the present and the future, And so that kind of seems like eternity, kind of like what Rebecca was talking about, where you're just in the forever now.
Okay, interesting.
Okay, then we also talked about time in regards to, we know that through eternity we will be keeping the Sabbath and we will be keeping new moons. So therefore we have to have some kind of a time to show us that. But we talked about time in the universe and in heaven because the angels come to worship on time for the worship time, you know, the worship hour in heaven. So there's got to be some kind of time somewhere. And we talked about the week of creation, in which time began here for the earth before the sun and the moon and the stars were created. So we were just discussing things like that. So I guess, Trent, you just take it from there.
Sure. Now, before you discuss this, why why are we even discussing this? That's a question that may be on some of your minds. Like, it might just seem like a topic of speculation or, you know, this or that, which isn't at all what it is, and you'll see why as we get into it. But why do you suppose we're even discussing this? Does anyone have thoughts on that before we begin?
Maybe some people don't believe that there will be time, you know, because there's a scripture that says time no longer, and so maybe they think that that means that time will be no longer, you know, that God will not use a timepiece anymore, that it's just going to be, as some people think, sitting on a cloud and having fun. I don't know.
Right. And some people do think that.
The Lord, there is time for everything. Everything is done on time. It's in the Bible somewhere, but those are just my own words. He does everything time. So he talks about time.
Walter typed in a couple interesting comments here. He says, "Truth is truth, and we never know the value until we have it. A real picture always helps." I think that's a really good comment. And it's, you know, and it is part of the aspect is, like you're saying, some people think that there won't be time in, you know, eternity or in the new earth or whatever. And as we go, we're going to be kind of discussing also, well, why does that even matter? You know, so what if some people think that there won't be time? Does that really even matter? And so as we go on, we'll kind of see what that's about. And I'll just state the basic reason why we're even discussing this is because much of the world and much of Christianity has a false view of this topic and God's relation to time, and that's the connection between that and various other issues which are connected to it. And as a result, it has been something which has separated us from our heavenly family, perhaps unknowingly to the majority of us. And so you'll understand how that is and why that is as we go on. But I just wanted to mention the basic purpose is that there have been false theories in regards to this that should be cleared up. If those theories never came in, there'd be no need to even discuss it. But since that has happened throughout the centuries and throughout the history of the religious world, there's a necessity to clear it up. So here's a question, and if people could think about it, and then this is what I asked. last night, and I think I mentioned it before. Actually, before this question, I'm going to ask another question. What is time? Because we should be clear on what we're even talking about here. What is time? Does somebody want to offer up a definition?
Oh, my.
The measurement of something.
Okay, I'm glad you said that. But the reason why I'm glad you said it is because we're going to distinguish. What we're talking about here is not the measurement of time. What we're talking about is time itself. Okay, and so I just want to distinguish that. We're not talking about, because measurement of time could be done in a number of ways. We have seconds or minutes or hours or months or years or whatever. Once you have something that's going on a constant basis, or that repeats, every repetition, if it's consistent, can be considered a measurement of time. So we're not talking about measurement, we're talking about time itself. And Teresa typed in here, she says, action, something in motion, changing. Does anyone have thoughts in regards to that? Walter says, the measure of life. Question mark. Does anyone else have thoughts on just how to define what time even is?
A continuum with a continuum. Time
Continuum.
Is a continuum.
He's really cutting
Yeah,
out here.
it's really hard to hear you actually, Michael. It's just audio.
If time is a continuum. Yet in itself, when we talk about time as a measurement, it's point A to point B with a start and an end. But time is a continuum, but the measurement of time is the start and an end.
Okay, so basically, in case someone didn't hear him, he's saying time in itself is a continuum, right? It's going, but the measurement of time is you have a point A and a point B, and it has a start and an end, and it keeps going, and that's how you measure time. But he was distinguishing between that and time in itself as being a continuum, which I find quite interesting.
It's Lorna speaking. Where my mind goes is what Ellen White said about time. And she called it a resource, the most important one for which we are most accountable.
Very interesting. And I think that kind of calling it a resource is actually really interesting. I'm not sure how that helps to understand or to define time necessarily, but it's telling us one of the things that time in fact is, which is very helpful. Does if anyone else has thoughts on that, feel free to mention it now, and if not, we'll kind of continue.
Well, I could say something here. A measurement
Sure.
of years. Time is a measurement of years from beginning, like my age, for instance. I know when I was born, and now I know based on years, how many years went by.
Right, and that's one of the things. What we're distinguishing here is we're distinguishing time itself from the measurement of time. And what we're going to be discussing is time itself, because even if no one was keeping track of time going by and giving a measurement to it, time would still be going on, even if no one was paying attention to how much time is going on. Like, for example, I'll just give a microcosm example of that. Let's say you're doing something and you're working, or you're running around, you're busy doing your things of the day, going from here to there, and you're not paying attention to what time it is. You're not really looking at a clock. You're not really looking at your phone or anything that would let you know. And, you know, you're just busy doing your stuff, and then all of a sudden you look at the clock and you're like, wow, that's, you know, it's 3 o'clock or whatever time it may be. Now, all that time, you weren't looking or paying attention at all to the measurement of time, but yet you were experiencing time itself, right? So the measurement of time at that point had no necessary relevance for what you were doing, although it existed, but time itself was still actively a part of your experience. So hopefully the distinguishing factors are becoming clearer. I know it might be hard to kind of put your finger on it one way or another. Now, Teresa mentioned something which is of value in this. She said that, you know, she said something about change and motion, right? Action, something in motion, changing.
I was thinking accomplishments.
Accomplishments, okay. Yeah, that's another thing. Now, this is going to sound like a really basic question in one sense, but do we all agree that time exists?
Well, yes.
Yes, okay. Now, what do we have as evidence or proof that time exists? And to help answer that, maybe consider the other side as well of what would it be like if time didn't exist?
Well, different things that have matter change, like, you know, leaves change color and they die, and you know, our bodies change. Everything that time reacts upon, I guess you'd say, changes. So we can see the evidence of time, but time itself is just such a nebulous abstraction.
Right. Okay, no, that's good. I mean, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, what about movement? Time exists because of movement.
Okay,
because
yeah.
If time didn't exist, nothing would move, would it? Nothing at all?
Nothing at all.
So if things move, we have to have energy for things to move, don't we?
That's true.
It takes energy for things to move. So if there's lack of movement, there's lack of time. And because we know there is time, then there is evidence of movement. Anyway, that just came to me, so that's all I had to say.
Right. I think that's basically pointing it right there. Would we all agree then that the fact that we have change, or we could call it succession, right? Or another way to put it is non-simultaneity. And what that means is things that are simultaneous, right, happen at the same time. Things that are not simultaneous, it's letting you know that it's just proof that time actually exists, right? And there's things that are not happening at this same instant, but yet they're happening in succession one to another. That's just proof that time is real, right?
And well, time is divided into past, present, and future. I guess if I sit here and think about it, the past used to be the future, but it's gone by in a linear manner. Now,
in a linear manner, that's interesting.
I don't suppose I could ever, no, I guess I can never, my brain can think about it, but I can never live in the past as a person. My brain can think about it. Then we live in the present. So the time,
right.
So if it's the present and it's moving in a linear manner, 5 minutes from now is the future. And what do I do with it? I don't know. But the future.
You make perfectly sense.
But the future will soon be the past, won't it?
Right.
Oh.
Yeah, no,
It makes perfect sense.
I'm ready.
Makes perfect sense in the sense of time as a continuum.
right.
And yet in the same breath of time, being a continuum, there's measurement within that continuum. And so time in itself is always, if time ceases to exist, measurement ceases to exist. If measurement ceases to exist, then all things cease to exist. Because all things exist as a result of measurement. In other words, life in itself is a measurement because it has a start and it has an end. And it needs to operate within the continuum of time in order to go from start to end. If there is no time, okay, then if a continuum ceases, then there will be no start and there will be no end.
Right.
I don't know if I go along with that 100% because with God there was no beginning and no end, and if time existed before we did, what do you do with that?
We'll get to all that in a second.
Good.
1 second. I was just saying, I think Lorna had a comment.
Oh,
well,
But-
I was thinking about what you said about succession. And that succession was created for us on day 4 in Genesis. It says that the sun and the moon and the stars, their succession, their successive movement, created time as we know it.
Okay, now, did succession exist before that?
Time is a process of this Earth's history, I think. Time began with this Earth, and it's a process of this Earth's history.
Okay, so
Relevant Earth.
So now, the reason I was asking, go ahead.
I'll just wait and hear what you say after I say this one last thing, but we discussed that this afternoon. But see, time didn't start with the sun, moon, and stars because, I mean, time was already in existence because they were not created on day 1.
Right.
They weren't in existence.
Thank you. That's a good answer to the question if succession existed before day 4, because we know, there was day 1, there was day 2, there was day 3, right? So that's showing that there was succession, although definitely I agree with what you're saying, Lorna, that those things were put in place to give us the measurement of time as we know it, right? But again, we're distinguishing between time itself and the measurement. Now I'll ask, here's the next question, and everyone feel free. Actually, sorry, go ahead, Michael, go ahead. Just noticed your hand there.
If we're going to use time in the sense of the measurement in which we're looking at an earthly portion of it, okay, then within the, when God created the earth, remember everything else, which all the other planets in which we see, and when he created the sun and all the planets that orbit the sun, we know this much, that for each planet, time is completely different. For the simple fact that each planet circles the sun, we measure the time based on the movement around the sun for the earth. But each planet moves around the earth at a different speed and a different time. Okay,
right.
So we can't look at it as at the time of creation, then time was created. Time was created for which? Which planet? Right? Did God create different times for different planets in that sense? Or is it that our minds just focus on the fact that God created time for this planet because it circles the earth, it circles the sun 360 times, 360 days, 360 days is correct. But within our solar system here, all the other planets, some going to much faster than that, and some goes there beyond that. So what is the true time? During creation, because it was all created at the very same time, correct?
Relevant to the earth. I think it's only
So for
Tim had something to say after that too.
because we can't really say that, because if it's only relative to the Earth in itself, then why do we on Earth count time in regards to the other planets? Whose time are we on? Just because we happen to be on Earth.
Tim, you had something to say?
Yeah, I think going back onto the aspects of what was put into place on the fourth day. One aspect of it would be looking at those timepieces were for to help us to synchronize in with a time cycle that was already going on. We were as we come into creation, we were joining in a melody and a rhythm and a frequency that was already in place. So the sun, moon, and the stars were giving us those appointed times, that which it seems to appear that as we are joining in our appointed times, that the kind of, if we can kind of fathom it, that the rest of creation is also joining in on those appointed times.
There is definitely legitimacy to what you were just saying there. In, I believe it's Behold Thy Mother Part 3, Lois quotes a lot of things from Ellen White, talking about the daily times of worship. And Ellen White even mentioned the hour of prayer before the fall in heaven. And we know that when Christ's intercession is in harmony, the times of intercession in the heavenly sanctuary is in harmony with the intercession here on earth. So it would seem that at least that place called heaven has similar or the same time measurement system as what we operate under. Although, as Michael is pointing out, different planets do operate under different measurement systems for time. So yeah, but it's I would agree that the time system that we operate under here on Earth has precedents that precede our experience here. So the next question I'll ask, and for those of you who I've already discussed this with, I ask that you just let people think about this before coming out with an answer. The question is, and again, we're not talking about the measurement of time, we're talking about time itself. Did God create time?
If there's music, there has to be time.
He created everything. Well, how about we just say that God put time in motion?
What does that mean?
Which created it, I suppose. So.
Well, you said an interesting thing. You said God created everything, right?
Yes.
Now, I'll ask another question. Did God create truth?
What was the word?
Truth.
He is truth.
Sure enough. Okay, now, we talked about this before. What is truth? In its most basic definition, we've discussed this before. Does anyone remember what truth is in its most foundational level?
It's what it is.
That's fair. It is what it is. I like that answer. Truth is simply actuality or reality or factuality. Truth and fact, truth and reality, those are synonymous terms, right? Something that's not true simply because it's not part of reality. Me saying we're talking on WebEx right now is only true because it's part of reality and it's factual. If that wasn't part of reality and I said we're talking on WebEx right now, it wouldn't be true. So again, I'll ask, again, that's reality, that's fact, that's actuality. Did God create truth? We're talking about the basic thing of truth itself.
No.
Well, I don't think he had to.
No.
I think
right.
Already truth is just self-existent.
Right. In other words, truth is a necessary part of existence. And if there was always an existence, if God always existed, then it was true that God always existed, and that was always true. In other words, truth always existed. God didn't have to create truth. However, as God proceeded creating the various components of the universe, he was expanding the definition of truth because he was expanding what is real, right? So in that sense, he created truth and continues to create truth as everything that's created becomes part of truth. But the foundational thing of truth itself was not necessary to be created. So the reason why I asked that was just to kind of give us a wider perspective when we make statements like, God created everything. Because what does that really mean, right? In other words, there are certain things that are necessary parts of existence that were not necessary for God to create. So here's another thing. If God created time, what was it like in the non-time prior to that?
Gee, maybe there's always been time way in the past, because God has always existed. So he must have existed in time past.
Well, and even to talk about things like eternity and having always existed, that presupposes time.
Right. Now, something with that, I'll just state there's two definitions of time, or sorry, of eternity that people operate under. One is that eternity is the absence of time. In other words, for God to be eternal means that God exists outside of time, is one view. The other view is that eternity is all time, as in past, present, future, right? So the other view is God being eternal means that he exists throughout all time, past, present, future, rather than outside of time. So that's, yeah, those are kind of two views on eternity. But the thing that, Joanne, the thing that you're saying there is very interesting, and I agree with what you're saying about time, and well, you're saying maybe time always existed because God always existed, and what you're saying, Carol, too, about even discussing eternity somewhat presupposes the concept of time. But what would, Lynn, you said something before about what things would be like without time, right? And because you were saying without time there could be no motion, right?
Right.
Now, when we think, is there motion?
Yeah.
When we're actually thinking, oh yeah, our body's full of atoms and
right.
All these things are moving around, the protons and neutrons.
Yeah, and so we know even thinking, and we know, like, for example, if there was no time, first of all, we wouldn't have the time to perceive anything. But even if we did have time to perceive something, we wouldn't be able to perceive anything because it even takes time for light to travel to our eyes. It takes time when we touch something for the senses to be able to comprehend, right? There's the time between our hand touching a table and the sensors in our brain realizing what's going on, right? That takes time. And so even thought itself takes time, right? And so the question is, if God created time, right, that would obviously show that there was a non-time prior to that. But during that non-time, could God be thinking? And there's two thoughts on that as well. The two thoughts are that either God would be not thinking anything, or he would be thinking every single thought simultaneously, since there's no room for succession.
It seems as though what I may be jumping ahead, but it seems like what you're getting at is that the false idea of eternity is that of an absence of time. And when I think of absence of time, I think of chaos. And I think of how different that idea is. You know, just it seems like immateriality is just more of, you know, throwing ideas out there that make heaven seem less real, less tangible, less understandable, less predictable, and also it goes completely against the grain of what we know, that from one new moon to another, that, you know, all flesh will be coming to worship the Lord, and these things that connect our world with heaven. And our
Right.
family with and us with the heavenly family, really.
True enough.
I can't remember exactly how she put it, but she did. Joanne was saying that, you know, God's always been there. So if he's always been there, time's always been there. It seems logical. But then we have to always remember
he is always in the past, in the present, and in the future. He can
Are you
do
sure?
it. We can't do it, but he can. He can be in the past, present, and future, all at the same time, I guess, if he wants to be.
We'll address that in a second. Michael has something to say, though.
If we're going to do, and I'll let you address the other issue of the past, present, and future thing. So I'll just address the issue of when we were supposed to enter heaven for the 1,000 years, right, before we return. What is used to measure the 1,000 years if time exists no more?
Did you guys hear what he said?
That we're
No.
not having any more time.
Well, yeah, he was just saying if, you know, what would be the use in saying we're going to heaven for 1,000 years if there's not going to be time in heaven?
Good point. Well, I think we all agree that time isn't going anywhere, is it?
Yeah, I think we all understand, since we understand about keeping the Sabbaths and new moons and so on. We basically understand that time will continue on throughout eternity.
Yes.
Comment? So wouldn't if we look at now back into Daniel, where it says, you know, like there seemed to be these emphasis that these sort of anti-Torah or anti-Christ beastly systems that would arise, they all would get into kind of some kind of fashion of kind of changing times and laws, and so we seem to been affected, you know, like even to today, like when and a lot of this restoration process that we're in, I think right now, is learning how to tell time, how to get back and into those proper you know, and so we're not so disoriented that we have a proper orientation, so that our experience of the future can become what it was intended to be when we have a proper relationship with how to tell time, right, and count time.
Right. Okay, so I'm thinking addressing the thing that Joanne was saying about God existing simultaneously in past, present, and future. That's a common thought in Christianity and Islam and Judaism. So we're going to kind of look at that. And I'm thinking now too, I'll just kind of expand on the whole thing of time and the different implications that are there depending on one's view of God's relation to time, right? Like what is implied depending on the views that we take, right? So I'm just going to kind of go through that, and then after I'll kind of address what Joanne was saying, and then see what you guys, any thoughts that you may have on this. So essentially, most people take the view that God created time, right? And at that point, there is kind of just two options as to, what existence would be like in the non-time prior to the creation of time. And again, it comes to the thing of either God would be thinking absolutely nothing, or he would be thinking absolutely every thought at that non-time, right? Or simultaneously. And so, I don't know of anyone who views, who holds the view that God was thinking no thoughts prior to creating time. Because, first of all, that does not make any sense whatsoever for God not to be thinking at all. By what means could we attribute existence to God if he wasn't even conscious of it? And the other view is God thinking every thought at the same time. And this is something that lots of people believe, and it's something that I was raised believing. And here are the implications of that. And many people who believe this don't really think about the implications. Some do, and even believe what the implications result in. But essentially what ends up happening is if God was thinking every single thought simultaneously prior to the creation of time, that would necessarily mean that he was simultaneously thinking, I am about to, and this is just an example, I am about to create the world, I am currently creating the world, and I just created the world. Right? You'd have to be necessarily thinking all those thoughts at the same time. And at that point, we also have two options. Either he was self-deceived and he wasn't doing all those things simultaneously, or all those things were true. And basically no one will say that God is self-deceived. So they'd have to take the view that God was indeed in that non-time prior to time's creation, he was indeed just about to create the world, currently creating the world, and already had created the world. And that thing of creating the world is just an example. You could say the same thing for anything. For example, in that theology or that philosophy, sin had not yet existed, was currently existing, and will never, or already was abolished from the universe, I should say. In which case, if that's the reality, then it will always be true that sin is currently existing, and it will always be true that sin never was, and it will always be true that sin has already been abolished. So you can see that what ends up happening with that view is that time itself and existence itself becomes totally static, right? If anything, including God, is experiencing all time simultaneously, in other words, past, present, and future at the same time, existence becomes a block, right? It becomes a static thing in which, I'll put it like this too, if God is currently in all points in time, right? If he is simultaneously in the past, present, and future, that means he will currently be experiencing the prayer that we prayed at the beginning of this study for all time, and he always experienced that, right? And he will always be experiencing every single part of the whole history of the universe simultaneously. Now, and so I hope you can see how that creates a block universe, a static universe in which time is just an illusion, right? Now, if that's the case, do we really have free will? If the future actually exists, right? And as far as God's concerned, it's already happened, right? If the future actually exists, how can we say that we have free will? The only way that we can have free will is if possibility is a real thing. and if possibility is a real thing, that necessitates that the future is not fixed, right? That it does not yet already exist. And so what ends up happening, going back to the concept of God thinking all thoughts at once, again, what ends up happening is, how do you even call that a thought? Right? Or thoughts. You could just say it's one big thought that's extremely complex, right? Now, if that's the case, then you could say, well, if everything, what that would, in other words, mean, and this is what certain people believe, and again, this is one of the things that I was raised believing, if God was thinking all thoughts at once and all his thoughts were true, then that would mean that all of us and everything that exists only in the mind of God, right? Because he hadn't created time yet, and time in that sense never really was created. But what that would mean is that in addition to thinking that the world was about to be created, was currently being created, and had already been created, that holds true for each one of us. In other words, each one of us would in that case be just as eternal as God. And basically, again, it would mean that we all basically only exist in the mind of God, in which case even the devil is just a part of the mind of God. And I know more than one person who actually believes this and is aware that this is the conclusion of what they believe, mostly because of a conversation that I had with them. But basically, you can see kind of more and more how the view of this, when you follow its natural conclusions, how twisted it really is. Again, going back to the thing of what is a thought, and that thought just being one complex thought, which all of us would be part of. If something is just one thought, right, it's hard to call it a thought because a thought requires a person to think it, right? If God was only thinking one thought and that thought was extremely complex, which is the entire existence of the universe, it couldn't rightly be called a thought because God would have no succession, and it requires succession in order to have personality, right? So you couldn't even rightfully call God a person. It's just this one thought, which is everything. In that case, you couldn't really even call it God, because God means a divine person or a divine being. So essentially you end with atheism, in which you have a static existence that you can call divine if you want, but in which case everything's divine and everything's God. And so that's kind of the conclusion of, you know, if you follow the concept of God creating time, that concept that God created time, if you follow it to its natural conclusions, you end up with an atheistic form of pantheism. Everything is one, everything is God, but God at that point just becomes an arbitrary title assigned to it to guise itself as theism or belief in God. But really it's just, you can't have a God. It's impossible for there to be a God who created time. And hopefully that all made sense. There's more I could go into, but any thoughts on that?
Well, that's okay. I logged out and came back. Is it any better?
Yeah, that sounds good so far.
Okay. Yeah, and I think we've discussed this before, Trent, you know, in that whole thought process here. And I'll tell everybody a little joke here. I get the little text from Trent going, in other words, keep quiet on the answers on something. It was sort of funny. Because I was sitting there rambling on, not even paying attention, and forgot that, oh, we've already discussed it, so I'm giving all these things. And it's like he wanted everybody else to answer it. So, but nevertheless, this whole like concept, you know, and again, it comes back to that thought, and I sent it in saying it's like we're living in a matrix. You know, I don't know if everybody ever seen this movie called The Matrix, and it gives that very thing that, you know, they plug into this machine. It's not really there. It's just within a thought, and they could do all these things, but reality is where they are right now. But in actuality, there's something going on inside of their mind, and they could plug in and plug out, you know, and it's not really there. So it's just, if you were to look at that concept that if time was static, then it has no movement. And if it has no movement, it cannot be called time by the definition of time, because time requires movement. So to say, you know, time before God created time, that's what we call by definition time before God created time, does not exist, because it cannot be definition of time. It must be given another definition, but it cannot carry the definition time.
That's why I was referring to it as the non-time prior to time's creation, because that's basically how people have to view it if they're going to try to wrap their minds about, you know, that concept.
And the mind cannot actually go to a point of wrapping their mind to a non-time, because even the very thought that they're having on that in itself requires time. It's impossible for them to think of a non-time.
It's actually, just comment on that, it's, you know, when people take that view of time being static, right, the problem is that it requires us to believe that our experience of time is a complete delusion, right? It's an illusion, and we're basically being tricked by it. But here's the problem. It is impossible to have an illusion of time if time didn't exist, because even the act of being eluded or being deceived by it is a temporal thing, right? It would require time to be deceived into thinking time exists, which is showing you that it is literally impossible for time not to exist if we experience it. So
yeah, that's the exact point I was trying to make there, is that it's
right.
Just the very act of even thinking on that point in itself requires time, and thus it makes it impossible that your mind would ever even think of a time that time did not, or I can't even say it, a time that time did not exist.
Right, a non-time prior to time.
Yeah.
And this kind of thinking gets at where my mind is going is the difference between what we've been taught about the difference between the Greek way of approaching life, the philosophy, and the Hebrew. The Hebrew is so full of time and practicality and the real God in the real here and now. And it's in the Hebrew, it seems not really possible to sideline God in terms of his real existence or real presence. Whereas in the in the Greek, it's possible to think you're experiencing him when you're really only experiencing an abstract of him.
Right. That's a very valuable comment. And that's actually, that gets kind of into the history behind all of these things, because as we're discussing these, you know, these are theological points that people have held over centuries and philosophical points that people have held. And every belief, all these things have history behind it, right? And the thinking that the majority of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam have today concerning time and God's relation to it actually does come back or come from Greek philosophy. You know, it came into Christianity again through the so-called Saint Augustine, and he learned it from Plato, and that was Plato's view of eternity and time and God existing outside of time and so on, which again, it totally impersonalizes God. God becomes totally impersonal, and it's really impossible to have a relationship with a being who is totally experiencing a static reality. Because you saying something, well, you already said it, and you never will say it, and you always had already said it, and you can't really have a relationship with a being like that, right? And again, just the Hebrew way of thinking on that, I mean, the Hebrews had a different, you know, we very much think in abstracts with our Greek minds, and, you know, Hebrews were thinking very concretely and thought very much in time, and even their concept of time wasn't even our concept of time. We think of things in past, present, and future. They didn't think of things in past, present, and future, and it wasn't just the Hebrews either. Pretty much all the ancient cultures, and there's different native cultures throughout the world who still view time not as past, present, and future, but as the complete and the incomplete, right? There are things that are complete and there are things that are incomplete, and that was their view of time. It wasn't abstract in any way, and it wasn't in the sense of past, present, and future either. And so when you're viewing things in terms of complete and incomplete actions, that's presupposing that time does indeed exist because you're talking about action, right? So let's see, I'm just looking at what Walter's saying. He says, so does God not know all things but can calculate possibilities? And Walter's talking about God's relation to the future now, which is another aspect which I was thinking we'll discuss as well. But before we just talk about the future, are there any more thoughts or comments on what we discussed so far?
Hey, what happens if in my imagination, I just imagine, I can take my imagination and I can go somewhere with it. I don't care where I go, say Mars or Venus or a little star somewhere. My mind is going, and I can keep it going forever and ever if I want to think about that and think about this. Is that reality, or is that a dimension of time? What's going on in my brain when I take it out of my head and send it somewhere?
Are you basically asking if all imagination is real? Like everything that we imagine, is that a certain type of reality? Is that basically what you're asking?
I guess we're talking about time. So is my imagination on a time clock, or does it just go bouncing around?
Well, no, it's everything. I'll put it like this: everything exists in time, right? Your imagination is time. The time clocks are somewhat relative in the sense of, like Michael was talking before about, you know, a day, for example, on Earth is different than a day on Jupiter, right?
Yeah.
Because it takes a different amount of time for our Earth to rotate as it does for another planet. However, I could be here on Earth and I could talk about Jupiter days and know exactly how that relates to Earth days. In other words, both measurements are just as real as each other, but we have to understand that that's all they are. They're measurements. They're not, it's just like centimeters and inches or Celsius and Fahrenheit. These are just different measuring systems, but it's measuring the same thing. Time is just, you know, things happening, not at, you know, not simultaneously. And things could happen simultaneously too, and that's also just part of time. But it's just the fact that existence is real and things are happening, and that's basically as simple as it is. You know, things are happening and not everything happens at the same time. And so how we want to measure that, we can measure that in any way, really. You know, there's any measurement that we could put onto it. But yeah, so what you're saying about imagination is, yeah, as we imagine things, I mean, we could compare the length of time in which we're imagining things with any measurement of time, whether it's seconds or milliseconds or whatever it may be. So we're thinking in time, and our thoughts, you know, just because I'm not sure exactly if this is what you were saying, but as we imagine things, we can, without a doubt, imagine things that are not real, as in everything that we imagine is not necessarily part of the actuality or, what is actually going on. It could just be something that we're thinking up.
And I suppose if your imagination is running around, I guess I'm still sitting here, and if my imagination is over there at your house, it's still taking time. Yep, it is still taking time. So it's got to be time.
Everything exists in time, really. But yes, please.
Well, this is just really interesting, and it just shows you that how important it is that we be logical thinkers. Because, this issue that you brought up about time really didn't seem all that relevant to my spiritual experience until I followed the logic train all the way through, and it makes me realize how the devil just basically wants to he's taken philosophy and he's created a system of reasoning and anti-reasoning, or whatever, false reasoning, and had that influence the religious world. But just so, for one thing and one reason only, it's to turn everybody into atheists, and even people that don't even know they're atheists, by being immaterialists and thinking these false things, and I know that that's affected my thinking, and I know all these other things like Lorna brought up, all these Greek ideas have come in and influenced my thinking in ways that I don't even know yet. And so I'm thinking that you're probably going to be shining the flashlight on a lot of things like this to clear up our understanding as we come to know the truth of who our family is, and that they do exist in a very real way. And that's our only hope, is knowing them in the complete reality of who they are and how they
Right. Amen. It does come down to it's very important to have an accurate perception of reality. It is very important. The way people reason when they're looking at certain issues like this, because really when you follow things through to their logical conclusions, you can see how really the thought of God being outside of time or creating time just really is nonsensical, right? It actually doesn't make sense and is self-contradictory in a number of ways. But, there's certain people who I've discussed this with, and they hold that view, and even after discussing it and seeing where it leads, still hold it. And the only thing that they've been able to say to me in that regards is, well, no, we can't understand it. That's why we know that God is outside of time and, all this, because it's incomprehensible. Like, you're just trying to figure out the mind of God, and that's basically the argument that's brought against it, is saying, well, you're trying to know the mind of God, and you're limiting God, and that whole idea. And again, that's something you could say either way. You could say that with whether you say God is in time or out of time, you could on either way say that you're trying to understand the mind of God, which isn't really necessarily even what's happening in the way that they're portraying it. But the problem is when people make an argument like that of saying, well, you can't comprehend it, and that is in some way supposed to be evidence for its truth. Let's think about that for a minute. Is that really does that even make sense as an evidence for something being true? To say that, well, it's incomprehensible. Because I'll ask another question, and this is, we're just finding out what it takes to make something incomprehensible. And so I'll ask you guys, this is something I asked Teresa when I was talking to her about this. Can you guys understand or comprehend or really imagine a colorless red car?
Colorless red car.
That doesn't make sense.
Right. No, even the way that you put that, saying it doesn't make sense, right? That's showing that you can't comprehend it, right?
No,
and I neither can I, right? Because really, and if any of us think about it, just try to think about it for a second. Can you imagine a colorless red car?
It can't be red if it's colorless.
Exactly. All right. So the whole point is that it's just a contradiction, right? Because you're saying that something is one thing and at the same time not that same thing, right?
Yeah.
So that is a contradiction, and there's no way around it, and that is impossible to comprehend.
Right.
The whole thing that we're getting to with that is just to say that to say something is one thing and at the same time not that one thing is a contradiction. And the whole point of that is to just understand that all we have to do in order to find something that is incomprehensible is state something that actually doesn't make sense, something that's a contradiction. So whenever we hear someone use something like that as some sort of argument for truth or something, or what they're proclaiming to be truth, we can know that it really just doesn't work, because when they're stating, oh, well, the reason why it's true is because you can't comprehend it, all they really could be saying is, well, it's a contradiction and you can't comprehend it because it's impossible to comprehend a contradiction. That's kind of the only reasoning that I've heard as to why that's the only justification that anyone's ever given to me as to why they still hold to the view of God creating time even after seeing that it is totally illogical. Their only justification is that, well, it doesn't have to make sense because it's incomprehensible.
It makes sense to me.
What makes sense to you?
Time.
Okay, well, that's good. I'm glad it makes sense to you. And it made sense to them, too. They understood exactly what was being said, and they understood that it actually falls apart on itself, the theory that they had. But people still choose to hold on to their theories because, again, like Lorna was saying, it's comfortable. And here's another thing to consider. When we view God as being outside of time or experiencing time, past, present, and future at the same time, what does that do to things like intercessory prayer?
Intercessory prayer.
Waste of time, then.
Waste of time. And I'll mention this, it's really important because even though, many of us perhaps have held some of these views about time, or kind of generally thought that, oh, God is outside of time or something like that. And many of us have held views like that for a long time, and not really realizing the implications, but subconsciously how that affects us and our relationship to God. I mean, this philosophy of time is one of the most damaging things to Christians and to religious people overall as far as their relationship with God. Because subconsciously, it doesn't make sense to us. Why would we need to go to God and pray to Him about something or have intercessory prayer when, well, God's already there in the future and He already knows, and all these sort of things. Even though we don't think it through and realize why it doesn't make sense, on a subconscious level, it doesn't really make sense, and it's hard for us to actually have a sincere intercessory prayer. Just because on a subconscious level we know it doesn't make sense, in our frame of thinking about this concept of time.
I have a question.
Sure.
So does God know the end result of everybody's salvation? Does he know
Right, now this...
who's going to be saved right now?
That's predestination. I don't think so. That takes away your free will, doesn't it?
Well, no, not
Well,
exactly.
before...
The idea that you know, because God is in the forever now or whatever, that he knows everything. You know, that he already knows where you're going to wind
right.
up. What's going to happen.
Right, now this gets into... I'll answer that as directly as I can, but kind of in order to do that, we kind of have to backtrack a little bit and just look at some more of the implications of this, right? Sure, but before that, again, I'm just looking at, we've been on this for about 2 hours. Did you guys want, we'll try to not have it go on too long, but did you want to continue on this, or do you want to stop and start again later or tomorrow or something?
Well, what I'd like to understand is, I've had so many different things said tonight, I don't know exactly what the truth is now.
Okay.
Did God create time, or did he not create time? I'm confused now.
Okay, so there's definitely a need to discuss this more. But before we get into the different aspects, again, do you guys want to continue discussing this for a while tonight, or do you want to stop for now? And
I will vote for tomorrow night. It's quite late where I live.
Yeah, we'll probably sign off here quickly, but would you be able to, in a brief moment, just give that answer to that question about knowing the future?
I can't really do that in a brief moment, no.
Oh, okay.
But we'll continue that tomorrow as far as not just that particular aspect, but how this whole thing that we were discussing relates particularly not only God's relation to time, but particularly to the future and the implications of that. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. All right, so as a recap of this, basically, in answer to your question, Rebecca, no, God did not create time because he didn't have to create time. The reason why we know that is because if God did create time, there would have to be a non-time prior to that. If there was a non-time, God would either be thinking every thought at once or no thought at once. If he was thinking no thoughts, then he wasn't even God and he didn't even exist. If he was thinking every thought at once, either he was deceiving himself, in which case whenever he did anything he wouldn't know better because he already thought he did it anyways. The other possibility is that all his thoughts were true, and if all of his thoughts were true, that means he was, before even creating time, doing everything and experiencing everything through all time already prior to that, in which case we were about to be created, we were currently being created, and we had already been created, all simultaneously in the non-time prior to time's existence, in which case we would be as eternal as God, and his thoughts of thinking everything at once couldn't really even be called thoughts because there's no succession. It's just one big thought that is just not even a thought, because God would then be impersonal because existence would be static. In which case pantheism is true, but you can't even quite call it pantheism because there's no means to attribute the name God to it other than by arbitrary grounds. So in other words, that's just kind of a brief summary of everything that we went over. God, it is impossible for there to be a God who created time. Just another quick point in summary of why we know that cannot be true is because if God created time, time itself, or our experience of time, would necessarily be an illusion. But time cannot be an illusion because in order to be illuded into thinking time exists, time is a necessary requirement. In other words, time has to exist in order for us to be illuded into thinking it exists. So hopefully that...
Could you write out what you just said and send it in an email? I think it was a very valuable train of thought, but I'd like to be able to really study over it.
Yeah, I'll just, I'll mention this very briefly. This is one of those things that, that must have been 8 months or so ago now, when I finally just decided to be friends with our Heavenly Sister. This and different implications that come off it, this is one of those things that was keeping me up, and this is just one of the things that she was kind of bringing to me. And so I kind of, one of those nights somewhere, I just kind of allowed my fingers to just go on a keyboard as all the stuff was coming to my mind. So there's a lot that well, not necessarily a lot, but all this is written down in one form at least, so I could send that off to you guys. These are things that we kind of have to chew on a little bit, perhaps, to really, look at the different implications of what it all means.
It sounded like a very lucid train of thought, and I was thinking as you were speaking, wow, you are at home with philosophical, logical, philosophical thinking. And then now you've labeled it as a gift from the Spirit. That's interesting. But it just came to you, and so as you're typing it for us, it will just come again,
Yeah, no, praise the Lord. And, I'll just mention about this whole thing about, it seems like this whole discussion just seems like it's way too philosophical for what we're used to discussing, I guess. But again, the only reason why it's kind of necessary, I'm just getting some echo here. The only reason why it's kind of necessary is because of the false theories regarding this that are widely held. So, yeah, it does kind of, in order to kind of logically reason it out, it kind of requires getting into what would be considered philosophy on the topic. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because I know, Ellen White talks about vain philosophy, but then she talks about, I forget if she uses the term divine philosophy or scriptural philosophy. I forget the exact term that she uses, but something along those lines.
Philosophy in the best sense is really revealing how we were designed. We were designed to think about these things and
right.
to avoid the pitfalls.
Definitely. And one of the things too, some people that I've mentioned some of these things to have said things to me like, oh, stop talking about that, you're making me think too much. To be honest, I think that's just terrible. Because we should be thinking deeply about all these things, right? And I understand what was being said before about thinking too much sometimes about some of these things can tend to confuse us, but that's only if we're depending on ourselves. If we bring these things to our Heavenly Family and ask them to help us comprehend it, they'll, cause us to be able to deep think and guide us into the correct understanding of these things. So, anyways, I know it's getting late for people, and it's probably best to continue on this tomorrow. Then, okay, I guess we'll close off now. So, Lila Tov to you all. Blessings. Shalom.